We're coming this morning to the middle point of medieval Christianity. We started last time, 2 weeks ago, you may recall, just introducing this very complex period that's hard to get your arms around. And there's so many little underlying themes that course their way through, little eddies that would be interesting to explore, and I'm having to pick and choose, and that's not at all easy. But I want to at least try as much as possible to keep our finger on maybe the principal ideas that run through this, even though we're doing a very rapid survey of it. But as I was indicating to you last time, in some ways, if we ask this question, this is one way of holding it up to the light and thinking about it, is this is another experiment, as it were, of the way in which the church is related to the world, or related to the state, if you'd like, to put it in those kinds of terms. We saw early on, in the very early history of the church, really the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the experiment in which the state persecutes the church. That's one way that we can be related, is to simply be constantly on the run, in fear for our lives. And I tell you, there are some people in church history who would say that's always when the church is at her best. Most of us would probably not opt for that arrangement. But nevertheless, we certainly have seen that from time to time, and even to this day, as you're aware, in certain quarters, certainly Islamic countries and other places in the world, you will continue to find that experiment in which the church is simply a persecuted sect, and so we have that. Then in the next couple of centuries, the 4th and 5th centuries, we have the situation where we really leap to the other end of the spectrum, and rather than having the state persecuting the church almost overnight, in the twinkling of an eye, as it were, with Constantine, we have the state mothering the church. And I could even say smothering the church. It's Constantine who's there in a very prominent and visible way, having a great influence on the way in which the church conducts her business. And again, that's not all bad. The people that were the leaders of the church were treated like royalty. And this was a time when many people felt that they'd almost entered the millennium when Constantine began to be so accommodating and deferential to the leadership of the church. But of course, that experiment has its problems as well, and we've tried to talk a little bit about some of those. The next experiment comes really in this transitional moment when we leave what I'm calling ancient Christianity and move into the medieval period. And sort of the apex fulcrum point in that experiment would be Gregory I that we looked at briefly the last time we were together. This would really be the situation where, in a sense, the church mothers the state. Imperial Rome gradually contracted and finally gave up its last whimper in about the year 476 with the death of the last Roman emperor. The empire itself really ceased to be any kind of empire at all. More or less a kind of very loose feudal system began to come in, as we will be looking at. And at that point, the only game in town was the church. It was the church that was the center of learning. It was the church that really provided a great deal of the economic substructure, such as it was. It was certainly the church that provided the philosophical foundations and belief system. It was the church that was there for the people. And even if folks weren't truly Christians in their hearts, there was somehow no other place to go. It was the church that had a monopoly on all of those dimensions of life. And so this was the experiment that we run into there. And there were some, as we might say, pluses and minuses along the way that we've alluded to. What we come to now is the 4th experiment, really is organized around the brief, shining reign of this fellow that comes right in the middle of the Middle Ages, or the medieval period here, whose name is Charlemagne. And so we're going to be taking a brief look at what leads up to him and trying to identify some of the themes that are associated with his reign. Depending on your perspective, maybe a high point or a low point, but certainly a magnificently unique point in the history of the church where this particular figure has his great influence. And so anyway, he's a tough guy to summarize because it's very complex, and he himself is bigger than life, really a remarkable character. I want to be as fair and balanced in my treatment of him and the forces that lead up to his reign as possible. having to obviously leave out some things. But the experiment that we find in connection with Charlemagne, I would put in this way. The church marries the state. So we've had mothers and that kind of thing. Now we actually have, in a sense, the two forces, the ecclesiastical and the imperial, more or less getting so cozy with each other that the lines begin to blur to the point that they become, if I can use the biblical metaphor, one flesh. And it's very hard now to distinguish where one leaves off and the other begins. And this is really the first time in history that we have quite this kind of thing going on. Again, we have all sorts of interesting effects from that, both positive and negative. So with that, let's have a word of prayer then, and we'll go ahead and get underway. Father, we are grateful to you again for this privilege that's ours of surveying the history of your people and the way in which you have been at work building your kingdom in a variety of ways, and we are the beneficiary of so much of what has happened. We pray that our reflection this morning on this very interesting chapter of the history of your work with your people would serve to incline us all the more to worship and serve our Lord Jesus Christ, who we name as King and embrace as Lord and Savior, and offering these prayers in the name of Jesus. Amen. Feudalism is obviously one of those very colorful times. I love to read, Sir Walter Scott and some of those guys who really give the romantic presentation of it. And I don't know, or Robin Hood, that kind of thing. Now, a lot of that is obviously buried in myth. And I have to say, honestly, I wouldn't want to live then. No, we don't want to go back to that, but one of those interesting times. And the kind of romance and gallantry and chivalry and so on, I think, is appealing to many who've done some at least light reading in that. That's really the rising social forces at this point. And really, feudalism has its roots in barbarism, the clannish kind of approach where the injury gives rise to the reprisal, and then you extend that principle to the clan and so on, and pretty soon you have what amounts to a kind of feudal arrangement, somewhat like the book of Judges in the Old Testament, where you have a decentralized system of authority and a lot of sort of localized power centers that tend to have varying degrees of either amicable or not so amicable relationships with others and that kind of thing. There's no political stability as such. It tends to be anarchic. It tends to be chaotic, really. And nevertheless, the church really infiltrated and insinuated herself into that culture then over the next several hundred years in this medieval period in ways that are interesting to read about and interesting to reflect on. The church had this really good positive influence for good, and yet at the same time couldn't help but be influenced by the markets that she was working with. Ideas like the rule of law rather than the rule of force you can really trace back to the church's influence. The notion that there should be orderly punishment for crimes and not simply reprisal and revenge you can trace to the church's influence. The Synod of Toledo in 693 passed a resolution condemning private duels, which were becoming more and more prominent. That didn't make them stop happening, but the very fact that it's not the way we should be resolving our disputes. Have you heard of alternative dispute resolution? How about a mediation here? That's the kind of thing you begin to see the church insisting that this is not a Christian way for these kinds of controversies to be dealt with. At the Synod of Poitiers, Poiters, in the year 1000, there was again a resolution that controversies should be resolved by means of law and legal principle rather than by means of force. There was a very interesting resolution that came out at 1049, which was called the Peace, or 1041, the Peace of God, as it was called. And it was the idea that feudal conflicts should not take place any time after Wednesday evening until Monday morning. And the church gave an elaborate explanation for that, tying it to things like the day Christ was crucified and Maundy Thursday, and the Sabbath was Saturday, and Then, of course, Sunday is the day Christ rose, and giving a very, very convincing argument why those days are off limits for your feuds. So if you're going to fight, it's got to be Monday morning to Wednesday night, and then it's over. And they really respected that, and so it was an amazing thing. We might think from our point of view that this doesn't quite meet the target of what we would call really, the epitome of Christian ideas about political controversy, but it was an influence, and it's that kind of thing that you continually see going on through this period of time in a variety of ways that are really quite interesting. A couple of things I'd like to accomplish this morning. The themes I'd like to look at briefly are, one, the way in which the church through this period of time was infiltrating, especially Europe, Northern Europe, moving west, really. This is more the Western story than the Eastern story, with missions. This is very important. We've all been touched by this, whether we're aware of it or not. And the other thing I want to touch on, then, hooked in with that really, is how it was that this figure, Charlemagne, comes to the surface, and what exactly can we make of him. So if I could just take a minute to maybe a brief, almost catalog, talk about a little bit how the various large segments of European society were touched by Christian missions. That may be interesting and helpful to us all. I'll begin with Britain. As you know, Britain, the British Isles, came under Roman dominion in the 1st century. And there was a Roman presence there all during those 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries up until about the year 410. That's when the Roman occupation left. And as you know, that's when Rome was feeling the squeeze from the barbarians that were beginning to pressure Rome at all of the points where she was vulnerable. And this far-flung presence, occupation forces here and there around the ancient world, were simply more than Rome could sustain financially or in any other way, or just the morale of the troops. All of those things began to decline in a hurry. And so the Roman occupation forces came home. The principal threat to the British Isles was the native population, sometimes called the Old Britons, or the Celtic population, was being threatened by Germanic tribes, largely called Anglo-Saxon. And they were a warring bunch. Many of our forebears are those folks, the Anglo-Saxons. They came from Germany. They were really usually regarded as the most ruthless, bloodthirsty folks of all of these barbarian tribes. And they were particularly putting pressure on the British Isles, and Britain in particular. And so as Rome withdrew, you find increasing pressure over the next couple of centuries until finally the Anglo-Saxons really settled in and more or less drove the old Britons back into the edges, back to Wales, Ireland, Scotland, other places, and then the main British Isle became occupied more or less by the Anglo-Saxons. The old Britons had been more or less loyal to a kind of Christianity which is called Celtic Christianity. It's very much like the Roman Catholic theology, but it wasn't really under the regime of Rome. The Anglo-Saxons, of course, were heathen. They had no kind of Christian faith whatsoever. But in the warring conflict, some Anglo-Saxons were captured as slaves and shipped down to Rome. And that's very important because Gregory I, who was the Pope, at least for part of that time, we've talked about him, was very impressed with these Anglo-Saxon slaves. He would see them on the auction block being sold off. And although to say it quite this way sounds a little bit racist, and I apologize, I'm just reporting this as history, you understand that, but he would look at these kind of blue-eyed, Caucasian, blonde-haired individuals, and he is reported to have regarded them as angelic. They were very unlike the indigenous population, and he thought there should be missionaries going to these people, you see. And so actually that was one of the things that impelled a huge missionary impulse to go to Britain, to try to reach these Anglo-Saxons, who were known as such warring, bloodthirsty, savage, uncivilized people. That was their reputation at the time. And so actually Gregory did that, and he sent a whole bunch of monks for the most part, the most famous of whom was a man by the name of Augustine. Not the Augustine, obviously, that we're familiar with, St. Augustine, but another St. Augustine, who became the chief missionary to Britain and to the Anglo-Saxon tribes. And he took about 40 monks with him, and they just infiltrated like guerrillas, you see, Britain, and began to do their missionary enterprises there. It was very risky business. Some were executed, martyred for their faith, but Augustine himself eventually had quite a positive impact, and over time, the Anglo-Saxon residents there in Britain came generally to faith. Augustine is best known because he established a very prominent center of worship in Britain that was called at Canterbury. And he, in fact, became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And, of course, you are familiar with that. That's had a continuing existence as a religious center of Christianity since that time. The old Britons who were drove out, as it were, to the edges tended to go to Scotland and Ireland, and thus Celtic Christianity has been associated especially with Ireland. St. Patrick, we've talked about earlier, really moved this population even more into a very Christian kind of culture and so on. In fact, Ireland became, over the next several years, a very important source of missions. Many missionaries went out from Ireland. One of the most famous of them is a man by Columbanus. Hang on to that name because we bump into him a little bit later. So Columbanus was an Irish Celtic missionary that went out in the early 600s. Actually a little later than that, but that's the general time frame. So you've got that story. Scotland I'll skip over. Scotland has a fascinating history in itself. Probably the most fascinating time of all is the Braveheart time of William Wallace and all that. That's a little later than our period right now, but nevertheless, there was also a prominent Celtic presence there. Scandinavia, we think of the Vikings. They worshipped, the chief deity they worshipped was Thor, and there was quite a bit of missionary enterprise launched into that region. I won't mention much more about it, except I think one of the more humorous features of the Scandinavian missionary enterprise is that those Scandinavians and that Viking culture, that particular branch, as we think of ancient European tribal groups, were resistant to Christian missionaries because they believed that Christian missionaries were, quote, corrupting the morals of the youth. That was exactly the position they took. It sounds a little bit like Socrates, you may recall, in Athens, who was charged with corrupting the morals of the youth, if you remember that from your ancient history. Well, the reason the Vikings made that charge against the Christian missionaries is because to them, the highest and most important feature of manhood was to really be just a person of almost unbridled violence on the one hand and fierce loyalty to one's family and clan on the other. And these Christians kept coming in talking about brotherhood and love and stuff like that. How does that fit, in a culture that organizes itself around principles of passion and conquistadorial, powerful excursions and so on? So anyway, it was an interesting little piece of the story. But generally speaking, there was great success in that effort as well, although it certainly took a lengthy amount of time. One of my favorite figures from church history also is associated with this period, a man whose name was Winfrid, W-I-N-F-R-I-E-D, whose name has come to be known in history as Boniface. He was commissioned by the Pope in 714 to go to the Germanic tribes. This would be what we call the Teutonic tribes there in what is present-day Germany. And he was a fascinating figure, a very powerful figure that went in more or less alone and at a great risk to life and limb, and began to preach the gospel among these, many of whom were still the Germanic Saxon tribes of that region. But one of the most famous incidents that takes place in church history is when he went and settled into one little village and began to preach the gospel, and the group there was actually listening rather cordially to him and had some passing interest in his message. But as he made his proclamation of the gospel, he became aware that the people were treating with great deference this alleged god, the god Geismar, who was in a huge oak tree. It was a god of thunder. And this particular god was deemed to be a resident in that oak tree, and that's obviously where the people were giving their chief allegiance religiously. And so Boniface thought to himself, well, there's just one way to solve this problem. And he picks up an axe and starts walking over to the oak tree. Now, you might think that these folks in the village would have run over and prevented him from doing that because of, the sacrilege or whatever. But they just thought this was going to be an interesting show. And they just stood back to see Boniface turn into a grease spot. That's what they expected. So Boniface goes and he starts chopping away at this huge oak tree. As you can imagine, quite a project. They didn't have chainsaws back then, so it took him a while. And nothing happened. He just beat away at that thing until finally, I don't know how long it took him, but obviously a while. Pretty soon that huge oak tree came crashing down, much to the astonishment of the population in that little village. And they were astonished, one, that Boniface had not been prevented from doing this. And then they were doubly astonished because Boniface took the lumber, which was the product from that oak, and built the first church in that little community, and then used some of the wood to heat his home through that winter, you see, to add insult to injury. These people were impressed, and they started lining up to avail themselves of Christian baptism, and this was just the kind of guy he was, just a powerful, heroic figure who really believed that what we sang, if you were in the early service, about one little word shall fell him. That was Martin Luther's comment on the devil. You see, when the gospel is preached, the demons flee in terror, and Boniface believed that and lived that principle out. So anyway, he and others become, the fodder for wonderful stories and little anecdotal information from church history that if we had more time and leisure, I'd going through. But that's one of my favorites and one that I hope will kind of stick with you. There was also missionary effort into the Slavic nations. This is an interesting story in itself. I'll just bypass it because, again, the constraints of time. But this would be the Moravians, the Bohemians, the Polish, and so on, Bulgarians. But the one that I want to focus on and really becomes important for the other theme we're playing around with this morning is what was happening in ancient Gaul, G-A-U-L, Gaul, which became, of course, later France. This, again, as had been the case with Britain, was brought under Roman dominion in the first century. Rome reached her most expansive size geographically in the first century. And so Gaul, Britain, and the far-flung regions there were under Roman dominion during that time. And the population in Gaul, that ancient population, was generally brought under the influence of Roman Catholic Christianity as Rome herself was shifted to a Christian perspective or a Catholic perspective. Nevertheless, with the corrupting influences happening in Rome, the same thing was happening in these other areas as well, including Gaul. Now, as the barbarians began to threaten that region, again, Rome began to withdraw. Again, in the early 400s, we have the same kind of thing going on. Rome is contracting. The barbarians are putting the pressure on. And Gaul becomes the target of several different, almost tragic occasions in which she was just overrun with barbarian tribes. The Burgundians, in particular, came through there several times, burning and looting and that kind of thing. But the group that eventually showed up and really ravaged the land in many ways, but stayed put, was a tribal group called the Franks. And hence the name France, of course, came eventually from them. Well, the Franks settled in there and became, as it were, the new prominent controlling population there in Gaul. They were just another, bunch of uncivilized folks like all these others. But nevertheless, even though they brought very little with them in the form of civilization, they did tend to absorb something of what was left of the civilization of Rome, and even something of what was left of the Christian influence there in Gaul. So there was a little bit of that influence already. The first great consolidator of Frankish power was a man by the name of Clovis, C-L-O-V-I-S, who reigns takes the throne in 481, reigns until about 511. He was heathen. He didn't have any Christian interest at all, but he did marry a beautiful Burgundian princess whose name was Clotilda, and she did happen to be a Christian. And she urged Clovis who was basically just a warrior king kind of guy, that he should place his faith in Christ and become a Christian. And he was very little interested in that. He was interested more in what was going to help him win the next battle. And she actually sold him on the idea that Jesus would help him win his wars. And well, Clovis was listening when he heard her saying that, so he thought, okay, I'll try it. And he prayed to the God of his wife, Clotilda, Jesus, for help in the next battle he was going to fight, which was kind of a big one, and a lot was at risk. And he won a stunning victory. It was sort of like Constantine, you remember at the Milvian Bridge, in this name Conquer, and Constantine wins a great victory. Well, the same idea happened here with Clovis. He just wins a huge victory. And he was observing that. He thought, oh, I see. After you pray to Jesus, you win the big victory. And so he immediately commanded all of his soldiers to become Christians. There was, in one day, something like 3,000 baptisms. I mean, these soldiers say, fine. You know, they march down to the water, baptized, and they all overnight become Christians. That was kind of the style of Clovis Christianity. And so he just announced that Gaul was Christian. And everybody just immediately converted at the point of a sword, basically. So we probably would doubt the depth of the heartfelt faith that invaded the hearts of some of these people. And yet you have to say, as uncomfortable as we would probably be with, this kind of evangelism, you'll sometimes hear people remark, oh, those Christians are always trying to cram their faith down other people's throats. I really rarely see Christians really trying to do that. But in those days, they were doing it. I mean, I want to go on record. It did happen. We have had those chapters in church history. This is Christianity. We are now going to cram it down your throat, and that actually did occur. And Clovis was one of the great ones. And that became more or less the style of Christianity. And yet, oddly enough, interestingly enough, I think remarkably enough, you actually see over the passing years and generations true, authentic Christian faith. I mean, it's like God can use the most unlikely and really unseemly methods sometimes to get the gospel to people. Obviously, we would never hold this up as a desirable strategy. I'm not suggesting this is the way we should go about it. All I'm saying is that God is so good that he'll use very unlikely, imperfect means to get a very good and perfect gospel to people. And so even something as unhappy as this was used in that kind of way. Anyway, Clovis left some very incompetent sons who didn't either share his faith, such as Clovis himself may have had it, which is a question. But anyway, their sons, more or less lapsed into something really less than a well-integrated kind of social order there in what was coming to be called France. And actually the center of power shifted from the dynasty, the successors to Clovis, to another institution which we would probably best call the prime minister. But at the time it was called the mayor of the palace. And the mayor of the palace, the first of these, this would be now getting into the late 600s. The first of them, in fact, was installed in 687, and his name was Pepin, P-E-P-I-N, Pepin of Heristal. He was the first of them. His illegitimate son, Charles Martel, is very important in church history. He was the second mayor of the palace, but he's really famous because he was the one who finally prevented the growth of Islam from reaching any further to the west. And this was at the Battle of Tours in 732. If you were here last time, you recall I talked about the growing threat that came from Islam, but eventually its growth was cut off, both from an easterly and a westerly kind of battle. And the westerly growth was terminated really at the hands of Charles Martel. Now that really catapulted him into a position of some international prominence and ingratiated him deeply to the Bishop of Rome, because Rome was, of course, feeling the threat of Islam, and Charles Martel became a huge, heroic figure. The Pope appealed to Charles to come and bail out the threatened Roman bishop on occasion, but Charles didn't want to do that. He didn't want to march over the Alps and go to that trouble. So even though he was heroic, he didn't really jump into the back pocket of the Pope as much as the Pope might have liked. The son to Charles Martel was a man whose name is commonly called Pepin the Short. I think they probably named him that because for the same reason that some people are sometimes called tiny, you know how the guy's 8 feet tall and weighs 800 pounds and we call him tiny. I think Pepin the Short was probably that sort of thing because his son, who was named Charles and came to be called Charlemagne, himself was 7 feet tall. And if there was any heredity at all going on there, then probably Pepin the Short was no diminutive character. But Pepin was more interested in helping out the Pope than had his predecessors been. And what you've got going on through this period of time is a growing, escalating relationship between the Bishop of Rome, who was really embattled during these years, I'll just touch on that a little more in a minute, and the most prominent center of military and political power, which was centered in France. And this growing relationship between Rome and France is what's behind the scenes, the currents that are leading up then to the birth of the Holy Roman Empire and the reign of Charlemagne. If I could just stop that piece of the story, I've thought all week how to quite tell this story and help it all make sense to all of us, but I'd like to just hold that thought. We've come to Pepin the Short here. Now we're going to go back to the ranch. We're back to Rome and talk about what was happening there and try to tie this picture together that way. If I could take you back now to Rome. You recall Constantine had begun his reign in Rome, but moved to Byzantium in the year 330 and changed its name to Constantinople. We covered all that, of course, some weeks back. This move from Rome to Constantinople was also a move of the political power, more or less, to Constantinople, leaving Rome to some degree twisting in the wind without as much of the defensive forces that had theretofore been available. And of course, as the barbarian threat escalated, Rome herself was exposed and in fact, on some occasions actually looted. And the most famous of those was in 410, the year that Rome was looted, and other times as well. In fact, the Bishop of Rome really many times played a very distinguished role in going out and negotiating with barbarian invaders to try to prevent as much as possible the gratuitous destruction of some of the great edifices and so on that were there in Rome. So the Bishop of Rome played a very heroic role during those years, but obviously was doing it more with the kind of moral, spiritual force as opposed to the force of a sword or something like that. Well, now, something else that was going on was there was a growing tension, increasing hostility between the Bishop of Rome and the so-called Patriarch of Constantinople. This is really the beginnings of the split between East and West. I'll actually tell that story next week, how the Eastern churches and the Western church more or less split in the year 1054. But it really begins way back here. And so you might say the more the Bishop of Rome needed help, the more Constantinople kind of closed ranks and wasn't willing to be as helpful as they might have been to their Christian brothers and sisters over in Rome. So that caused the Bishop of Rome to look elsewhere for help. That is for just, political, military help against the advancing, threatening barbarian hordes that were beating at the door. And so the most prominent source of help seemed to be those great kings over the Alps there in Gaul, especially as we get to this later period of time when we have the mayor of the palace now, and Charles Martel and so on, showing quite a bit of military clout and accomplishing some good things and being apparently quite positively disposed toward Roman Catholic Christianity. Well, as I say, there were a variety of occasions with increasing frequency where the Frankish armies would march down into the Italian peninsula and bail out and rescue, as it were, the Bishop of Rome. This would always have a quid pro quo to it. So the Roman bishop would say, look, if you'll come and do this for us, then we will do this for you. And usually this for you that would be done would be to give some great spiritual blessing or some great spiritual title or something like that. In fact, it was the Bishop of Rome that actually crowned Pepin the Short King of France, you see, and gave him those kinds of, so it was kind of a reciprocal relationship here. Meantime, the Frankish kings were giving various pieces of real estate and other sort of tangible earthly benefits to the Bishop of Rome. My point in all of this is simply to say you have a growing interrelationship between the two that became very cozy and very mutually beneficial to both sides. Now that brings us to the figure that really will occupy our attention for the rest of our time this morning, who is this fellow Charlemagne. Charlemagne, as I say, was the son of Pepin the Short, and so Charlemagne is born in 742. He came to the throne in 768. He shared this throne in France originally with his brother, but in 771, through a kind of palace coup, Charlemagne became the uncontested ruler of all of France. The thing that really distinguished him is he was probably more than any of his predecessors really fascinated with the Roman Catholic Christian religion, and he loved the religion of the Catholic Church. He was fascinated by it, and he wanted as much as possible for his reign as a king to be somehow legitimized and closely allied with the Bishop of Rome in particular. He had a vision that he largely derived from his studies of St. Augustine, and in particular his love for the book by Augustine, The City of God. If you know that book, you know that in that particular work, Augustine argues for the gradual growth of the kingdom in a way in which the city of God becomes increasingly dominant in the order of this world, that sort of thing. And Charlemagne liked that notion and kind of saw himself really as realizing some of that great design, that he could actually help to build the kingdom through the political powers that he could wield. And so he wanted very much to have the blessing of Rome in his military exploits and so on. He has been generally regarded as ultimately being the greatest ruler in the West since Julius Caesar, and there was no one like him, a successor to him, except maybe Frederick II of Prussia, who we'll touch on later in this series, and also Napoleon maybe could be put in there. But Charlemagne really stands out as a huge, unique figure in many ways in the history of the West. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, he was proclaimed by the Pope to be the emperor, not just the king of France, but the emperor of the reborn Roman Empire. So even though Rome had died back in 476, she came alive again under this particular person, but now it was called the Holy Roman Empire. And this new entity, such as it was, had a persisting existence for the next 1,000 years. The Holy Roman Empire did not actually finally terminate as a recognizable political, corporate, entity of some kind until the 1800s. So this was a very important moment in the history of the Church, as well as in the history of the West. Charlemagne himself, as I indicated to you earlier, was about 7 feet tall. He was described as having a very bright face and shocking, long, white hair. I just think he's one of these people that looks surreal, and he had a powerful presence about him. But he was kind of a real guy, too. He loved hunting, he loved fishing, he liked outdoor activities and sports. He enjoyed football on Sunday afternoons, and he was that kind of guy. He also, however, was highly cultured. He enjoyed music, the arts. He was a fairly intelligent man, rather gifted, but certainly a genius when it came to political administration. And so we have to credit him with really knowing what he was doing. He was devoted to religion and religious studies and read avidly all kinds of classical religious writings, specifically, of course, Christian writings. He loved Augustine. He would like the City of God to be read to him aloud as he ate his dinner. He would listen to Augustine's reading. I don't know how deeply all of this penetrated his moral life. He had many marriages, many concubines, and so at least at that level we'd say he was less than really exemplary. But nevertheless, he certainly had some of this external interest that we at least would want to note in passing. He was generous to the poor. He gave liberally in many ways in terms of almsgiving and that sort of thing. But at war, he was vicious. So he was and very successful. He carried on something like 50 military campaigns, each of them expanding the scope and size and geography of this kingdom that had been originating in France. So by the time he was done, you have a geographical expanse that is almost as large as Rome was in the day of her greatest expanse. So he became the emperor of the world in many ways with the sponsorship and support and moral advocacy of the Pope backing him up. He conquered the Saxons in Germany, but that was probably his toughest challenge. I mentioned to you earlier, the Saxons were kind of famous for being so resistant and hard to beat, and they really put up resistance, but finally they surrendered and broke beneath the overwhelming powers that Charlemagne brought to bear, and this was in the region of Germany. Charlemagne always required Christian conversion. He was like another Clovis. This was sort of the culture. And so many people, of course, converted to the church under Charlemagne, but again, we'd have to question the extent to which their conversion was really a display of any kind of genuine heartfelt faith. But the Sacs finally did capitulate beneath the weight of Charlemagne's powers and did convert, and the Roman Catholic religion was really exported into that region. However, the Saxons did maintain a kind of inner resistance, a sort of cultural independence that never died out. And so even though they became officially Roman Catholic, and externally you would say they were good Roman Catholics, and certainly many people of genuine faith, provincially were produced out of that Saxon Catholicism. Nevertheless, they were always known as being a little bit renegade. And thus it is no great accident that only a few hundred years later, the whole course of Western history would change at the hands of a Saxon monk whose name was Martin Luther, and whose great protector all through his life. The reason Martin Luther was never executed was because he was under the protectorate of a man whose name was Duke Frederick, Elector of Saxony. You know, the Saxons always had that kind of standoffishness a little bit, and so we want to keep our eyes on that particular piece of the story as we go along. But nevertheless, Charlemagne certainly had the external victory in all of these efforts. He had immense respect for the clergy. He also brought great wealth into the church. You might almost say this was a time of a paradigm shift for the church. The church had become quite wealthy in many ways up until this time, but Charlemagne's wars of conquest made him unspeakably wealthy, and he gave huge amounts of wealth to the church. So the church became much, much more wealthy, and that became, of course, part of her downfall in many ways at a later time. In fact, I should say to you, just to keep our overall perspective here, the pinnacle moment that's reflected in Charlemagne, when you've got the state and the church married in this huge, expansive enterprise, and the whole world, as it were, is being swept into this ecclesiastical, political monolith kind of deal. While many good things happened there, many things we would certainly deeply question, nevertheless, from that point on, it was a very precipitous downhill trajectory. Charlemagne had no successors that even remotely resembled his competence. His sons were buffoons, and they just sort of, were worse than you could possibly imagine in undoing the great gains of Charlemagne. And so he was a kind of a shining figure there, but it unfortunately didn't continue. And by the time we reach the year 1000, which is where we will be next week we're finishing this period, launching now our studies into the next section of church history. By the time we reach the year 1000, the church has reached an abysmal level of corruption. The saddest chapter, really, in many ways, of the church's history is when we come down to that period. Stories of multiple popes vying for the throne. And he's got, girlfriends and illegitimate kids and all. It is even Roman Catholic scholars, if they're honest, will readily admit this is a huge, dark chapter in the history of the church. And in many ways, it was the result of the church becoming too wealthy, too powerful, and of course those are not the tools, those are not the weapons that are good for the church ultimately to accomplish and achieve her purposes. So we see that object lesson played out rather strikingly in this ongoing story. But in any event, for whatever the consequences may have been, just make note of the fact that Charlemagne made the church rich. And of course at the time, he thought he was doing a very good thing. Charlemagne on one occasion did come to Rome. Actually, the Pope Leo III at that point was once again being threatened by a local invasion of the Lombards, and Charlemagne brought immense military force to the rescue. And there's kind of the celebration worship service which took place on Christmas Day, the year 800. Charlemagne was on his knees, prayerfully, gratefully thanking God for the victory that had been provided in this most recent conflict, and really that was the rout and the final end of the Lombard threat. And unexpectedly, although this has always been questioned, but unexpectedly, but very dramatically, the Pope took a gold crown and placed it on Charlemagne's head, and at that moment announced to the gathered throngs, "This is the Emperor of Rome." You see, the Roman Empire. So December 25th, year 800, the Holy Roman Empire is born in that dramatic moment in which Charlemagne was crowned. Now, some people have thought Charlemagne wasn't expecting that. Don't you believe it? The whole thing was contrived in advance. It was part of the dramatic flair of the moment. But nevertheless, Charlemagne then reigned as emperor year 814 when he died, and that deterioration I've otherwise described took place from that. He was a man deeply devoted to education. He's sometimes called a great Renaissance figure before the Renaissance. He certainly was. He provided free education to all children of noble birth, which is a lot better than anything that happened up till then. And so that was provided. His educational strategy used the classical educational curriculum called the trivium, if you're familiar with that. Grammar, dialectics, rhetoric. There's been a real revival of the trivium, you may recall, or you may know, in contemporary American education. Little classical education schools are popping up all over the country. We have one here in Spokane, the Oaks, and there's been others elsewhere that are actually adopting that classical view. But that was what he used in his educational strategy as well. So in any event, Charlemagne died January 28th, 814. As I say, the precipitous decline is really quite a story, and we'll be picking up some of those loose ends next week. But